Welcome. Today's post is, Tom Banks, Bretton Woods to Forrest Gump to Tiger Woods. Published on October 4, 2022. Just 1 year after ping pong diplomacy, the whole world became obsessed with ping pong. The very first mass-market video game made its debut. What game drove everyone to begin making arcades? Ping pong. What a coincidence. Of all the sports that exist, ping pong was the logical one to adapt into the earliest digital games. They created the demand at the same time they created the supply. Here is the list of topics we'll be decoding today. If you'd like to jump to a specific section, just scrub to the timestamp shown. You can always find the topics and timestamps in the description below. Let's begin. Ever hear of ping pong diplomacy? Blockbuster Forrest Gump dedicates a major section of the film to it. The biggest movie of the year in the USA. It was a huge story in 1971. The head of China and Nixon decided ping pong was the perfect way to bring both countries together in friendship. Why ping pong? Why not 1,000 other sports instead? Baseball, soccer, basketball, you can name dozens of sports more popular than ping pong. Even so, they decided to make everyone in the world take notice of this game and get invested in it. I know why. The year after ping pong diplomacy made the whole world get obsessed with ping pong. The very first mass-market video game made its debut. What game drove everyone to begin making arcades? Ping pong. What a coincidence. You could argue that they made ping pong because the demand was there, but as I just went into, why did they pick ping pong? This is why. Because of all the sports that exist, ping pong was the logical one to adapt into the earliest digital games. Thus, they created a demand as they created the supply. Putting ping pong on everyone's lips so that when they saw the first arcade cabinet, they would be primed to pump in as many coins as possible. If they hadn't done that, it'd be a very different world today. Apple computers got its start through Atari, after all, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But why? Why did Nixon and Mao cooperate on this? What does Atari have to do with it? What about Vietnam, which both leaders were also focused on? It's all connected. First we have to understand the players. Nixon. Let's get the obvious out of the way. If there was one word to associate with Nixon, 100 people would say, Watergate. But he did many other things, like ending the Vietnam War. Curiously, this happened alongside Watergate. January 15, 1973, Vietnam War ended by Nixon. January 15, 1973, for Watergate burglars plead guilty in federal court. Keep in mind that this was January 1973, the month when Nixon went from 49-50 state winning popular to the bottom. The connection between Vietnam and Watergate is one of causality. Vietnam was supposed to go on forever. How many wars does this apply to today? The true purpose of Vietnam is not hard to see. Yearly budget for the entire United States government was less than $200 billion during this time, and how much did the war cost? September 2, 1969. The first automatic teller machine in the United States is installed in Rockville Center, New York. September 2, 1969. Vietnam revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh dies. You can even see on his death they sent a comm making it clear how certain parties viewed him. That he was just an ATM machine. Nixon ended Vietnam, and so they timed Watergate to it as a counter-punch. This is why his numbers plummeted precisely when they did, as he was given a chance to keep the war going, and then they likely would have called off Watergate as a scandal. In fact, I've come to realize this week that Watergate itself was likely an agreement between the two parties. This fits a template I've decoded for other stars elevated to power only after agreeing to be blackmailed, the logic being Nixon made a promise using it as leverage that he would keep his word to it. It explains how he got that 49-50 state wins. It also explains why the left kept the House/Senate that year. It also explains these comms, which in past posts I decoded to demonstrate the coordination. February 1971. Watergate recording device installed Oval Office. February 1971. Willard released, rat horror film. June 23, 1972. Smoking gun tape, Nixon confession. June 23, 1972. Willard 2, rat horror Ben with Michael Jackson's breakout hit, You've Got a Friend in Me. Nixon likely miscalculated his ability to control and defuse the situation. That's all highly speculative, but it fits my understanding of events. And of course this song, one of the most famous of all time, punctuating the complete victory. Demanding surrender. March 2, 1974. Grand jury concludes POTUS Richard Nixon is involved in Watergate cover-up. March 4, 1974. First person to kill self by jumping off the Space Needle. March 4, 1974. Waterloo ABBA album. These days, Watergate remains as the ultimate scandal, but there is a reason history chooses to focus on certain details and not others. What does this have to do with ping pong? The answer might be in what they were going to replace war with. While Rothschild/banks/speculators were the big money winners, all of it was designed to be cooperative with the military/allies. I.e. giant warhead/metal/car purchased, and banks get a cut in all sorts of ways. So if you cut the system, what then? Just killing the feeding tube doesn't do anything except make the military unemployed and the banker move on to the next target who will gladly take their spot. This is perhaps why the question of, what next, was raised. What are they going to replace war with? The answer? Pong. Well, not Pong specifically, but this tech industry that began its infancy then. This is what they decided as an avenue, and China as an ally fits that hypothesis because where did they get their start out of poverty as a country? Was it not in toys and electronics? To end the billions coming through war lining the pockets of Rothschild meant they needed to cover the finances somewhere. Who precisely was it that Nixon had run awry of? Who were his allies? The answer to that is well documented. How much do you know about the Nixon shock? For it to have that name means at the time this was a very big deal. As it says above, part of what made it a shock was the fact that he did not consult the international bankers. He ended the convertibility of USD to gold. What does this mean? Is this good? Bad? Why? Bretton Woods. In the 1940s, the United States took over for Britain as the world's reserve currency through the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. At the heart of this agreement was the promise that banks would be able to convert USD into gold. As official history goes, the United States of America became the most powerful country in the world post-WW2, and the fact that the entire world had agreed to use the USD is not a coincidence. It is often argued that the USA is the world's superpower specifically because of the USD being in that position. Why would Nixon end that? Nixon said the following of his motives: in the past 7 years, there has been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now who gains from these crises? The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help create them. He went on to say, this action will not win us any friends among the international money traders. I suspect this was true. Note how central bank get cut off in 1971. Note what happened as he exited. A nod to gold being back. August 8, 1974. Nixon announces resignation. Plus 6 days. August 14, 1974. U.S. citizens allowed to buy and sell gold. His popularity didn't drop instantly, and I suspect this is for a few reasons. One of which, as said before, he hadn't cancelled the war in Vietnam, also because this change by Nixon was said to be temporary. I.e., it became leverage of his as a bartering chip that he could return to if the banks cooperated. Plus, and perhaps most importantly, the forces against him were not representative of the bulk of comms-aware people. It was just the most powerful and dangerous. When did those dangerous people fully play their cards rather than give threats? Right as his popularity begins to drop. January 7, 1973. Mark Essex sniper killing police, hotel taken out by sharpshooters. January 8, 1973. Watergate break-in trial begins before Judge Sirica. Defendants include Hunt Liddy McCord. The trial and threats. This is why, he went on to win 49 50 states, but then became the most unpopular person in the world in short order. To understand the forces against Nixon, we have to understand how banks run things. What are banks used for? Is money power? Rothschilds listed as bank heads, and moreover note Q highlighting UK as their home. Note Europe/Japan pulling gold in high quantity just before the shutoff. That's official history, but the important point is the comms, as they will tell us the real motives and sequence of events. And you can see below the respective gold supplies that countries spent all their gold pre-WW2 and then got it back from the USA. You can see the USA supply dropped dramatically leading to the day Nixon stopped the convertibility, the Nixon shock. So the simple answer then is Rothschild/bank as the opponent of Nixon, right? Yes and no, certainly the largest problem, but there's more to it than that. What did Nixon expect to happen? He began the breakdown of the Bell monopoly, but clearly chipping away at the behemoth wasn't enough. This is why we need to talk about China's Mao. Note the same time frame as Nixon was making friends with him in 1971. He was dealing with coups. Some interesting changes in China that year with banks. December 17, 1971, Bank of China privatized. December 17, 1971, World banks get together at Smithsonian agreement to save Bretton Woods by devaluing USD. If we assume both parties were trying to wrestle control away from the banks. Let's consider some other comms around that time. February 1, 1971, Mao convinces table tennis body to allow China to plan, beginning of ping-pong diplomacy. February 8, 1971, Nasdaq world's first electronic stock market begins. February 8, 1971, WWF champion Russian Bear loses to Pedro A. Morales. Given the push was for tech, the timetable connection to Nasdaq, this creation of a new stock market seems relevant. The Russian Bear lost to man named Morality that day. This could signify a positive change. WWF may seem small, but context is key. The prior WWF champion was the Italian Bruno Sammartino. May 17, 1963, Bruno Sammartino longest title reign begins, one from Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. June 21, 1963, new pope from San Martino installed. He held the championship for 7 years, and when he finally lost it was to a Russian Bear who then lost to Pedro Antonio Morales. I suspect his initials are to invoke Pan Am, as it also became a target around the same timeframe as Nixon. It was also deeply connected with the military and blackmail. Check my Pan Am post for more. Anyway, so, Morales beats the Russian Bear, and Bear has a specific context in stocks as being a bad market, so taking control over it. And for it to be Russian, that may imply affiliation of stock control. I suspect this was an effort to switch from the power centers of banks. However, it all failed. Whatever cooperation Nixon had with China fell apart, and Nixon's partner in ping-pong died right after he was ejected. August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. July 1976, Mao heart attack. July 1976, China earthquake kills 250,000 Chinese. September 9, 1976, Mao dead. Note how Nixon resigned August 8 and Mao died 9/9. That doesn't happen on accident. And then, his wife and allies. Arrested/killed/suicide. Gang of 4. All arrested in 1976 and all died later at curiously similar times. Perhaps used for messaging. I just find that curious. A military coup, who was at fault? Same day of Mao's death we get this telling line. No Soviet domination, which implies a Soviet connection to this takeover of China. October 6, 1976. Gang of 4 arrested in Beijing. October 6, 1976. President Gerald Ford stumbles says there is no Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. October 5, 1976. Warner buys Atari $28 million. September 11, 1977. Atari 2600 released. Who controlled the Soviets at the time? Rothschild/CIA is a starting hypothesis, and from my many decodes it's often Mossad that ends up on the opposite side of them. The number 1 and number 2 intel agencies, and Nixon saved Israel from the pyramids which were said to be backed by the Soviet Union. So it all fits. To illustrate which side moved with threats. September 8, 1972. Palestinian terrorists storms the Olympic Village apartment of the Israeli athletes, killing 2 and taking 9 others hostage. So Mossad was behind Atari's Pong. Hardware of the Atari, Mossad technology. Mossad Israel. And there's quite a few more pieces to suggest this. Nixon/Mao Ping Pong Atari Pong entire video game industry. Being on the wrong side, Mossad, meant that Atari was marked for the kill. This is why gaming control was transitioned from Atari to Nintendo. In exchange for game market domination, Nintendo agreed to stay out of movies. We can see that agreement with the terrible video game movies made that certainly existed specifically for Nintendo to assert they would stick to their industry. Nobody muscling in on another territory. They also cooperated with the KGB in all sorts of other ways which you can read about in my Pan Am post. This doesn't mean Mossad was cooperating with this path, there were a great number of attempts to create a path to profitability. May 17, 1977. Likud, Netanyahu, wins first victory over left wing in over 30 years. May 17, 1977. Atari co-founder Bushnell founds Chuck E. Cheese. To fully kill Atari, they intentionally flooded the market with bad games like E.T. This explains why Atari was buried. Came under fire alongside when Reagan rose up. Profits dying 97%. Note the terminology shared. Shock. 1971 Nixon shock, Bretton Woods END. 1983 Atari shock, video game crash. And what company replaced Atari again? August 13, 1971. Friday the 13th decision made to end Bretton Woods at Camp David. September 13, 1985. Friday the 13th Super Mario Bros./NES launched end of video game crash. Nintendo. The choices of dates demonstrate Nintendo was asserting themselves as the replacement. The symbol of bad luck implies Nixon's use of it was hitting the banks, and this was the perceived counterpunch to take over the Mossad-controlled industry. This is probably why Mario is a plumber, as that was the symbol of Watergate. A way to have the symbolism of their defeat of Nixon live forever as an example constantly replayed on loop for any that think about challenging them. Moreover, we can trace the origin of Nintendo's good fortunes to Atari being removed from competition. Steven Spielberg's E.T. was said to be what killed Atari, and there is a deep meaning to that symbol. You may recall in my last post I discussed the power behind E.T. was used as an example for other companies of power. That the only thing that mattered was whichever one Spielberg was involved with. The point being which one had backers of God. It becoming the biggest of all time to that point is no coincidence, and Spielberg is an important link for following the historical comms. Did you know while he worked on E.T., which I've just demonstrated was intimately linked to Nintendo vs. Atari, Spielberg secretly directed another major motion picture. June 3, 1982, Nintendo debut Cross, Holy, directional pad becomes standard on all Nintendo hardware, wins Emmy for design. June 4, 1982, Steven Spielberg written/secretly co-directed Poltergeist, secret due to contracts with E.T. When I went to decode this film I had no idea of the game connection, I decoded it while watching it, and most of this post came to be from that rabbit hole. Poltergeist is 100% about Nintendo. First of all, I highlight the cross design of the Nintendo controller because cross is an important symbol. It's the same symbol for Godfather strings plus the same symbol Q uses to represent the pyramids. Note the Mossad Atari symbol being a joystick, which is interesting given I've decoded them as deep into blackmail. Both sides are into blackmail as it seems to be standard practice for securing a position. There are many differences in symbolism tied to each one. I've gone over how in Lord of the Rings dwarves were confirmed by the author himself to symbolize Jews, and I had decoded that before hearing the official account because the comms clarified the elf/dwarf fighting in the literature to be symbolism for CIA/Mossad. And the factions that preceded each. Trying to understand which companies are plants for which side is not an easy undertaking, but I've made strides recently. Clearly Nintendo in the 1980s with the Cross was sending CIA/Rothschild comms. This implies that during the same stretch Sony had paired with Mossad and Mao before it, and this is why they were crushed in the format war. Nintendo specifically made the Nintendo look like VHS players despite the original looking more like a Betamax. Keep in mind Betamax came out a year before VHS and was a superior product by most accounts. The fact that the inferior VHS beat Betamax despite Betamax being released far ahead of it is a testament to how important picking the winning side is. And this Mao/Mossad connection to Betamax is also evident in the death. September 9, 1976. VHS introduced by JVC to compete against Betamax. September 9, 1976. Mao Zedong death. Makes it clear the affiliations and the changing tide of a technological war. In the subsequent years Sony changed heads and partnerships many times, and as a result it's harder to pinpoint where they stand, but knowing where they stood then is a great start. Given they have since taken over the market multiple times with multiple products including video games, it's likely they began cooperating with those forces instead of competing. Nixon was destroyed in all sorts of ways and comms coordinated it in so many places I would crash the post if I catalogued them all. One comm for example was from Steven Spielberg. It's a film I decoded before, but I didn't understand the bigger significance. His very first film, Duel, was timed to the end of Nixon's countdown. I go over it more in depth here as a comm. It's notably originating from Playboy and about the day JFK was killed. The end of a president. August 15, 1971. Bretton Woods ENDS by Nixon plus 90-day freeze on prices and wages. Plus 90 days. November 13, 1971. Duel Spielberg feature-length debut breakout hit for Spielberg about JFK death day. November 13, 1971. 90-day Nixon freeze ends. The symbolism being a threat to do the same thing to Nixon as they did to JFK if he didn't begin cooperating. This is probably what prompted the cooperation in the form of Watergate, which fell apart with his decision on Vietnam. If you read my Spielberg post linked above, I go into the history of Duel as it relates to Jaws, as the films were deeply connected. 1975's Jaws is famously the first blockbuster movie of all time, and his status as king of the film industry began that year. It continued for decades, and he remains the #1 director by box office. All of his movies have important comms, and with that in mind let's get into that horror movie written by Spielberg. August 13, 1971. Friday the 13th decision made to end Bretton Woods at Camp David. June 3, 1982. Nintendo debut Cross, Holy, directional pad with Donkey Kong becomes standard. June 4, 1982. Steven Spielberg written/secretly co-directed Poltergeist, secret due to contracts with E.T. June 11, 1982. Steven Spielberg written/directs E.T. biggest box office of all time. December 1982. E.T. For Atari credited with major role in video game Crash. July 15, 1983. Nintendo first released in Japan, launch title Donkey Kong plus Cross Pad. September 13, 1985. Friday the 13th Super Mario Bros., Plumbers, released in Japan. This film, while not entirely about Nintendo, involves many comms about it and what would come to pass. Poltergeist. As I went over before, this film is, in part, connected to the end of the military efforts to transition into games. Atari/Mossad. This is why the film begins by playing the Star-Spangled Banner while showing the Iwo Jima flag. There is no logical context for this in the film outside, but it makes perfect sense as a com. Why? The symbol is of American endurance failing. Song lyrics, our flag was still there. Reconcile that with Nintendo kicking Atari out of the video game market. This is what was to happen in the following year, and this film was a marker for it. Giving context to people who don't understand why suddenly Atari went from top of the top to garbage. Partly done by Spielberg's E.T. even. This is why his com is tightly attached to it. In fact, the official story of how Nintendo was able to get into stores Atari couldn't is because they sold it with an E.T. knockoff. Complete with stretchy neck, head shape and body shape. The first sequence of the film with the family golden retriever, money taking, starving and being forced to eat crumbs going around the house stealing food. Symbolism of lack of funding to the American family. Specifically the Reagan family, but we'll get to that later. Then we get to the first iconic part of Poltergeist, with the little girl hugging the static TV. The iconic scene with the girl and the TV comes later, but this one is also on most trailers. However, just to get the meaning crystal clear in your head, let me explain. Throughout the film the ghosts are called the TV people, and for some mysterious reason you can hear the ghost better on one channel rather than the other. Don't ask me why, it needs to be on a specific channel. Note Nintendo Switch CH3, CH4 depending on TV. There is a dense message in this film that I'll deconstruct about how Nintendo was viewed before they became a phenomenon. Before they became loud. Because remember this film coincidence with when Nintendo introduced the Holy Cross controller, it predated the Nintendo which used it by 11 months. This is why it's static just like any TV from that time period would be when the game is connected to it. Talk louder, as in it's just starting to get going. Which is juxtaposed with a man having a lot of trouble riding a bike, and note his color scheme of bike being the same as Atari's Pong. He races but two kids with a yellow plus red toy cars trip him. They laugh as he hurts himself and spills his beer. There is no context for this given anywhere in the film, the kids are just random jerks and this guy is barely in the rest of the film. The toys symbolize precisely how Nintendo is able to get their product special treatment while Atari is removed. This is a friend of the Poltergeist family. They cheer while he frantically gets his beer to the game with his friends. They are watching football, and he rushes to get their spilling beer all over them. The mother cleans the kids' room with Star Wars toy robots all over it. This is symbolizing the success of the CIA, as Star Wars was the second big blockbuster after Jaws and E.T. was the one after that. Remember E.T. came out the same week as Poltergeist. Both written by Spielberg. The mother finds their yellow Tweety bird has died. This is likely symbolic for two things, one being a canary in a coal mine warning, but also symbolism for the cash cow of Atari dying. And then the men watching football find their broadcast has been changed to a kids' show Marv Rogers. The problem is the neighbors have the same remote control clicker, and so they have a war over who gets to watch what. Note the guy who brought in beers leaking everywhere asserting his entire life is bet on this game. Clicker symbolism being game controllers in this context, a fight over who gets to use the television. The life being bet on it as in people's livelihoods. People betting on the wrong horse finding themselves bankrupt. This especially fits with the football connection as the USFL in relation to the NFL. The USFL was just like Atari in that it was another attempt at breaking into the CIA territory. The death of the USFL is right alongside the death of Atari and all other ventures. When you look into how they managed it involved distracting people every time any good news would happen for the USFL and hogging all the spotlight otherwise. Timing John Elway's announcements to remove any coverage of the biggest USFL event, for example. Note how innovative the USFL was in inventing instant replay and other things the NFL simply stole. Same exact thing happened with Atari and others. You'll also notice a death on the bottom left. This is also a part of it. It's not just the threat of ruination but actual harm. This is what MK ops are used for, to remove people and sow fear. To create distractions as necessary, and this is how alongside their bank control they can retain ownership over everything of value. Kicking anyone not in the club out. May 26, 1982, E.T. release Cannes Film Festival. May 24, 1982, Reagan proposes to transfer DOE to Commerce but KKK Robert Byrd-led Congress refuses. May 24, 1982, ABC ESPN USFL signed 2-year $18 million contract for 1983-1984. NFL gets hundreds of millions. So the yellow bird is almost flushed but instead given a burial. Note the dog licking his lips over the bird. This dog is named Buzz. And is named from a low-budget parody from Saturday Night Live not worth going into. The symbolism though is just like with the USFL of being low budget and trying to make money but affiliated with the wrong side. The yellow bird is traded for a goldfish, which is juxtaposed with a clown in the kids' room with stretchy arms. A somewhat famous clown who later in the film is shown to be a child rapist. This is likely symbolic of a comms-aware family making a deal. Obtaining a goldfish in exchange for getting involved in Mossad perverse ops. This is why despite CIA running circles around them in the 80s, Mossad still has power and grows because they secure key positions using kids. This is also why they show the boy straddling a tree that will later reach in. The symbolism of the boy, Oliver, is in an olive branch. The other major film he starred in at the same time is even more blunt with child perversion. Scene begins with a priest looking at altar boys like a playboy, followed by a discussion by the kid of his father being a psychopathic sex pervert. There's a lot more I could decode in this, but let's move on. The important point is the symbolism is of someone being on the wrong side, and this isn't just a message that Atari was dead, but that anyone hanging on would be as well. This is what is meant by location that is cursed. If they leave they get to be safe. This is an American family. Note the kid reads Captain America and the father reads a book about Reagan. The gold-haired daughter overfeeds the new goldfish which the mother says will turn it into a shark. The first spook of the film happens the following morning post goldfish/clown. When the spoons and forks get bent. As this happens the daughter turns the TV to static to watch it. The symbolism of bent spoons as I go over in other posts is of warping perspective. Later on the kids will be kidnapped by the TV people. Remember that they symbolize Nintendo, which would do what? Kidnap kids. Making it so that they can't hear their parents. In fact, it's kind of a famous thing with what video games do to kids. The story ends up being of them trying to get their children back from video games. There was an understanding that these things were going to be addictive to children, and history has proven it correct. Warping perspective is accepted these days, but before video games it was less prevalent but very much intentional. As I stated before, this family was symbolized with Atari/USFL/Mossad side. The home has an Atari, and in the original script a major scene involved it, but we'll get to that later. The message here is of the futility of fighting the CIA. The family doesn't win, they simply lose their house at the end, which symbolized the industry that was about to be killed. Perhaps best said as they shouldn't try and muscle in on any industry the CIA decides they shouldn't. The family adopted the goldfish and got the clown, which the kids hate. The kid antagonizes it by shooting it and then covering it with a Chewbacca. Chewbacca is a symbol for Bigfoot, which is itself a symbol for murder. The action of the child pretending to kill the clown and then throw Chewbacca over it is of the impending attacks on anything connected to Mossad. Remember, the clown was symbolically obtained through the goldfish, which was their payment for bringing kids into the blackmail. This disturbing reality of both sides blackmailing with kids is how Spielberg can portray the comms of threats as no less evil than what was already going on. It is one intel agency being string pulled to another one telling them to stop doing what they are doing or else they will use their size/power advantage to crush them. The fear of the molesting tree outside leads the kids to sleep with their parents after complaining about the arms of the tree outside. The father asserts they needed that tree as it protects the family. This issue of being protected is key. Are they protected? This leads to the famous iconic scene of the girls saying, "They're here," the one scene most associated with the film. It's punctuated not just with Iwo Jima, symbolizing Japan winning this time, but also the Lincoln Memorial, a symbol of another assassinated president. This was the year after Reagan was shot by a celebrity-obsessed mentally ill man. "They're here" has several meanings. The obvious one being Nintendo, but the context was also a dead president. Reagan had just been shot the prior year, and it bears mentioning that a famous celebrity death is the little girl from this film dying while filming the third film. This is a logical extension of her comms in the film. This brings me to the root symbolism outside of the NFL and Atari games. The dead child has the initials of HMO. As in health insurance. A symbol of protecting your child by not making an enemy of Jaws. Having her die just like Brandon Lee did is to amplify the messaging. A message of affiliating with the Mossad clown/tree was not the ticket to protection. So after the Lincoln symbol and "they're here," we get an earthquake and then waffling. Deciding which way to go in affiliation, as the TV people have arrived. The changing of hands from Atari to Nintendo of the industry. The chairs get ready for new guests and then form a pyramid. This leads to the girl being pulled into a position while sitting. Sitting equals as in playing video games, in this context, which leads to the little girl being abducted by the TV people. The invite over paranormal investigators to help get back their daughter. The most famous role in the film and most parodied is the 4-foot-tall woman named Zelda, as a psychic to clean the house and retrieve the daughters. She tells them they want the child for earthly pleasures, and before we get into that in depth, let's discuss her symbolism. The family afflicted by the poltergeist into Reagan. The psychic that helps them later on is the Jewish Mossad, named Zelda, and is a little person. Also the famous name of Nintendo's second biggest franchise. The fits the comms of the decade, as I already went over two other short comms tied to Mossad symbolism. Michael J. Fox and Michael Keaton, both of which I go over in my July 17th post. Flying foxes. Also Zelda. The symbolism of a target, I go into that subject in a few posts. Making examples of people who become issues. This is the symbol for rescuing Zelda, as in saving them from the curse by cooperating. This is one of the biggest comms sent, alongside Mario, Plumber, just like the Watergate crew. The dwarf in the film Zelda, I went over her connection to Nintendo, but there was one other thing that came up. That she was famous for being the spokeswoman for Skittles. This led me to decode Skittles through another of their spokesmen. Note same day the other spokesman for Skittles, Lynch, began he had his most famous moment. His first day he did the Beast Quake, Beast Mode, and that just so happened to be the same day of a famous shooting of politicians. Note Skittles' original design is that of a target. Like for shooting, 1974 origin, and a mystery about who invented them. Nobody takes credit. Which is bizarre unless it's a comm, and yeah, that's the perfect comm to marry with keeping who ordered a murder secret. This fits with Zelda comms. So the kid has been stolen by something symbolizing Nintendo. How do you get the kid back? Part of the answer given is using authority as a parent. But mostly it's a tennis ball. The symbolism of sports, forcing the kids away from the idiot box. It may seem like a huge step down to go from death threats to a discussion of proper mental health for kids, but remember that the kids' rooms were full of Star Wars toys. A major part of the symbolism of this film is in contrasting the pull. Earlier the kid was literally being pulled towards what society is pushing. Obsessed over watching static, i.e. video game channel. That was about to be Nintendo's turn as it was pushed to every kid across the world in a scope unheard of till that point in history. A Star Wars/E.T. sized push which Mossad could see as this film was released the same week as E.T. The next big blockbuster after Star Wars, specifically targeting kids. Specifically showing how much pull CIA had when they wanted kids to obsess over something. Mossad meanwhile was holding on to Atari, and they can see the countdown till their own demise. Without a doubt they can't compete, and that is what is being written on the wall with this film. The pull is so incredible that your own children, just like with Star Wars/E.T., will literally be obsessed within a year with whatever we tell them to. In this case, that's mind-numbing games. Hence a tennis ball to save the kid from this obsession. It's a joke as they are going so over the top to demonstrate how powerful their push is. Giving what amounts to emergency parental advice as the only chance you have from keeping your kids from becoming zombies in the coming years. Consider today with cell phones and kids. This was the origin of that, literally given the Game Boy. That's not the primary message of the film, that's just getting the kids away from the kidnapper that was coming. None of that resolves the primary calm of them being affiliated with the wrong side. It is merely dealing with the incredible power of their competition. The family being in danger is not arbitrary, there are threats going on here with multiple levels. One of those levels is financially tied to Nintendo. Note, Zelda, the Jewish little person most famous in Poltergeist, the role she had before it was released the same day Donkey Kong was released in America. It introduced the award-winning, cross-game pad that Nintendo has used for every system made since. The film is about homeless people trying to get jobs on The Wizard of Oz. I went over that film in my last post as it represented several things, symbolizing the change from silent to talking as well as color from black and white. This is connected as one of the major points of the NES was its revolutionary graphics for the time. The fact that it was relatively cheap is likely due to taking losses per unit in relation to what Atari could manage so as to be a whole generation ahead of the competition. Note the star of this film being born April 4, 1944. Talking about Phase 4, in Japan the connotation is death. Which is in being cursed, it's not just about destroying the competition but threats. Remember they traded the goldfish for a clown. This is the scene with the Atari. It specifically asserted they are playing their new Atari with Space Invaders. And then the girl tries to put her doll head on, but it comes off. This is followed by the clown in another famous scene doing what can only be described as raping the child. This is made more clear by the fact that the very next scene involves the mother being stripped and goes into raping motions as she pleads with it not to touch the kids. So how did we get from Nintendo replacing Atari symbolism to blunt ghost rape? The answer is in them still being affiliated with the house. By taking on the goldfish/clown, they are associated with the Mossad blackmail ops. This is them deciding to finally leave that cursed house. This was a point of film I skipped over before as it wouldn't have made sense then. The construction workers on their house spying and ogling their underage daughter. Getting home improvement in exchange for them getting to spy on their underage children. Their house gets destroyed, and then they have to move into a new one. Remember the Atari/Mossad/Reagan symbol. They move to a hotel and then kick the TV out of it. They have officially removed the house, so it works as an end to associating with Atari/USFL/Mossad. Don't misunderstand either, Mossad is clearly into blackmail but so are all the major players as far as I can tell. That includes Nintendo as their success is purchased with their cooperation in such fields. It's not that they get free publicity to be the top, there is an exchange for everything. The film is presenting the cost of standing on the side of the losers. It's not just that Atari will lose but those on that side will be destroyed. When I was going through the NASDAQ/Bear comms at the start of the post, one thing I didn't mention is what Steven Spielberg was doing at that time. February 8, 1971. NASDAQ World's first electronic stock market begins. February 8, 1971. WWE champion Russian Bear loses to Pedro A. Morales. Let's back up to when the Russian Bear won his title. January 15, 1971. Steven Spielberg directs TV show, The Name of the Game with Joan Crawford. January 17, 1971. Super Bowl V Baltimore Colts first Super Bowl post-AFL-NFL merger. January 18, 1971. Bruno Sammartino's 7-year reign ended, lost WWF belt to Russian Bear. Note Joan Crawford's connection with Spielberg. This got me to dig into her, and I noticed her final appearances were with Steven Spielberg. She was a legend ending. Her first husband was Fairbanks. This was the son of the guy I decoded in my last post as the king of the silent film era, and so it seems she was being used to send comms about transition for the next generation. I also notice a curious comm with Spielberg and her involving loss of eyesight. The episode he directed with her involved someone buying a criminal's eyes to look at art only for the universe to torture her with a blackout until her vision fades. When I dug into the show further, I noticed the other show she did outside of Spielberg also focused on eyesight and murder. November 8, 1969, Steven Spielberg TV directing, Night Gallery film with I Donation with Joan Crawford. November 10, 1969, Sesame Street debut. That first episode. I had to censor with the text box because the original version has nudity. It can be argued this is fine given the less sexualized children of the era, but the symbolism of the episode, which I go into in my Big Bird/Bird post, the intent is in surveilling kids. Sesame Street equals Open Sesame. Middle East/Saudi Arabia phrase origin. There are a number of transitions in these ops, and most of them have markers indicating when and why. Sesame Street is, as best I can tell, when they moved surveillance from local to offshore so as to keep it out of the hands of the government. This was after JFK seized the original MK Ultra material and used it as leverage. One of the reasons he was killed, check my Rat Pack post for the details on that. The Joan Crawford was famous for playing rags to riches stories, and that's precisely why regular citizens get into the local surveillance game to make their way. A ladder from rags to riches by helping the MK ops. Joan Crawford ending her career and Spielberg beginning, which is a logical way to mark a generational shift in ops to a new offshore system. The aforementioned Stolen Eye story Joan Crawford made with Steven Spielberg was a story of buying an eye from a thief. Which, when we consider this, is what the government did by seizing the existing MK evidence, eventually to be partially brought out through the Church Commission and the 1977 MK Ultra hearing, then the story of her stolen eyes fading out is symbolic of the futility of that action, as they would never let the truth be heard. Note the year they finally had the MK Ultra hearing, they had the famous 1977 New York blackout. It fits with the symbolism of the blackout in the story. She is blind and buys a crook's eye, so she can look at her art for a few hours before returning to being blind. However, a blackout hits, robbing Joan Crawford of seeing anything despite having purchased temporary eyes. A warning if the government chooses to steal the eye. This change in government away from the MK means it went offshore, and so the military became more moral around this time. Thus Pedro Morales becomes world champion. The Morales symbol is not clear to me yet if it really means moral, but I did notice when that wrestler lost his title it was the same day Black Sabbath became popular. 666 imagery. The day the press went from ignoring to embracing Black Sabbath with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, this may be nothing, or it may represent the change we saw around the time period. One last oddity on Spielberg that came up as I was digging. This probably means nothing but January 6, 2016, Politico, HRC donors include Soros and Spielberg. January 9, 2016, £66 million, the largest jackpot lotto in the United Kingdom's history. 66 is a shorthand for 666. January 9, 2016, giant gold Mao statue torn down in China. The lotto perhaps being funding symbol for her and the tearing down Mao in relation to what HRC represented. Remember what he represented to the pyramid. Someone that was trying to wrestle control away from them through the banks. HRC would be a glorious return to control by banks, as unlike Obama, who was tied to Saudi Arabia, her strings were firmly affixed to Rothschild banks. I go into this in many posts, and UK is where Q highlighted Rothschilds as residing primarily in. This is all highly speculative. I find it curious and am mostly using it as a transition. This brings us back to Forrest Gump. Recall the ping-pong he engaged in. Note the cross in that symbol where he picks it up. Now it's an easy thing to find that symbol in a hospital, but cross is a very specific symbol we've been digging into, so it may well be a calm tied to it. We went into the cross symbol, the origin of the Nintendo controller. The moment they invoked that symbol, fortunes were in sight. Now to understand how Forrest Gump fits in, we need to decode the film. What kind of a name is Forrest Gump? Note a key person behind it. Roth. Banks. Note Q connects Rothschild to not just banks but church, cross, and P for Pope. What kind of a name is Forrest Gump? What's another name for Forrest? Woods. What kind of a name is Bretton Woods? I believe Forrest Gump is intended to represent something connected to banking. Forrest and Auntie Mame. When I looked up Bretton Woods, I noticed the same day there was a Forrest getting top billing in a famous movie that won many awards. A story about a stock market crash survivor. A logical symbol for promoting Bretton Woods affiliation. December 27, 1958. Bretton Woods operational. December 27, 1958. Forrest Tucker in Auntie Mame's story about stock market crash survivor. The film being timed to Bretton Woods with the star, Forrest, is not likely coincidental. Forrest in context of the film is the rich man who dies climbing the Matterhorn, leaving Auntie Mame the Macy's employee rich. Macy's was founded in New York within a day of Teddy Roosevelt's birth in New York. Teddy Roosevelt also climbed the Matterhorn on his honeymoon with Alice. This is meaningful because Teddy Roosevelt is someone I've gone over extensively as the takeover of the country for Rothschild. He only became POTUS due to a heart attack of the VP and murder of President McKinley in 1901. This is why he installed the famous owl in 1902. He was also famously a pedophile, as I've decoded in numerous posts. This is likely why his Matterhorn climb with Alice was symbolic. Franklin D. Roosevelt died the same month as Hitler in his fourth term. He also began at the same time. January 30, 1933, Hitler Führer date. March 4, 1933, FDR inauguration day. January 20, 1937, FDR's second inauguration date. From this point on, POTUS inauguration moved from March to January. 1941 FDR Atlantic Charter, Bretton Woods precursor. January 20, 1945, FDR fourth inauguration. April 12, 1945, FDR death. April 30, 1945, Hitler death. FDR marked the beginning of the Bretton Woods system through his Atlantic Charter. I originally decoded his death as the military ousting him, but now that I have a much better understanding of history, I recognize he likely was just another fake death and an agreement made with the bankers to switch ownership. An agreement with the banks so the military could run the country. The exchange being so long as they were left in power of the world, rather than risk a military versus bank fight. They began cooperating, and that's what Bretton Woods is all about, as we discussed before. There's a lot of aspects to it. In Auntie Mame, she works at a job likely symbolizing wiretapping before working at Macy's. Given the child connotation, this is likely about blackmail. Note also the connection of Macy's to Gimbel's stores, as both have the first Thanksgiving Day parades, originally Christmas parades, a celebration of rampant growth in taking over the competition. Also Red Star. Note Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third party so as to split the vote and get Woodrow Wilson into power. November 22, 1920, Woodrow Wilson delineated border for UN Armenia-Turkey. November 25, 1920, Gimbel's Thanksgiving Day parade begins. The control over puppet blackmail, and in fact if you look into the story. Note below, Auntie Mame enrolls a young boy she has custody over into a nudist class where young girls pretend to lay eggs while having a light shined on their genitals, and then the boys come and do what gentlemen fish do. That's a precise transcription of the plot on the left. You can't easily interpret that any other way than children engaged in sex with adults. It's hidden only by the fact it uses language to obscure itself, but if you precisely read it the connotation is clear. Forrest dies in the course of the film on the Matterhorn while married to someone clearly steeped in child predation. Combined with the date connection of Bretton Woods to Auntie Mame, it implies the old system had died, and a new one took its place. This is perhaps why the film involves raising a successor. This is similar to the story of Forrest Gump, as the whole film leads to Forrest taking over the role of a parent to his child. This is where Gump comes in. In the film, Forrest Gump makes his fortunes with Bubba, it becoming Bubba Gum Pea Shrimp. I had already decoded bubble gum some time ago. Define stock bubbles. Bubble gum introduced 1 year before the crash. Note during the Nintendo years was another one. This is how markets can be cornered, so even when the bubble bursts, who owns what's left? Which companies were tiny before 1984 and bigger now than ever? Nintendo and most car companies there come to mind. What does it mean that Forrest Gump symbolizes stock bubbles? Forrest Gump. It begins with a feather being blown by wind which Forrest puts in his book, a book that notably has a picture of electric poles. This is a symbol associated with pumping something full of energy. Akin to promotion. This is why he asserts of chocolate he could eat 1.5 million of these, as the scope is highlighted of what he can provide. Funding. With that we see a Chevy Citation 1981 ad go by. This is a reference to the goal of Robert Zemeckis' first summer blockbuster Back to the Future. As I go over in my time travel post, the point of that film was much like with Poltergeist, a warning of affiliation. The reason why he drove a DeLorean after it was killed by the market? Because it symbolized being on the wrong side. The head of GM, Citation, competing directly against them, but then he was destroyed in every conceivable way. Then a discussion he has with a woman played by Margot Moore, wishing he had shoes like hers. Shoes equals jobs. Gump asking if she wants his support. When she says she doesn't like her shoes, Gump goes into a story of his own magic shoes. Note she is black, as this will be relevant shortly. What kind of job is he offering this black woman? Note the discussion of his ancestry. The KKK. This has a dual meaning. It is acknowledging the funding origins of what Forrest Gump represents. But in story context it's also explaining what Gump wants from the black woman. As in racial pushes. I remember when I was a kid I had a game where I would flip through all the channels on TV and I would try and find a black person not talking about race. I did this game over 100 times and never, not a single time, did I ever find one. This is far less pronounced these days, but you get my point. This racial division has been a major societal push for a long time. Why? Because Gump, Rothschild, demands it to be so. Funding it. The way control is attained is through blackmail, and this is why Forrest begins his story with his mother running a hotel. Not just for lodging of travelers but very specifically involving sex with her to better her son's future. And now that we have hotel plus sex, what next? The answer is Elvis, who as it turns out Forrest Gump is the one who makes successful by teaching him how to dance. Him being in the blackmail house is to say he is owned. This will be a running theme in the film, people who Forrest Gump takes from nobody to world famous and rich. This is what it means to be pumped full of banking. CIA support not just banking but promotion, though the two are deeply connected. Now even more important is the fact that Elvis died. Note Forrest's answer on why. That he sung too many songs. This is a running theme and also the precise reason why Forrest Gump is portrayed as stupid. Because the cult has turned so many people into superstars only to have them turn on them when they grow a conscience. We'll see it with JFK, John Lennon, and more. All characters Forrest interacts with directly right before they die. This serves several purposes for symbolism because he is telling this story to Moore, the black woman who I just decoded is being offered a job in racial division. Telling her the dangers of crossing him. More than that, it also works as a symbol because the mentally handicapped Forrest Gump also invokes MK Ultra comms. This works as a symbol because typically the way these murders are set up is activating a mentally disturbed individuals. Forrest then meets his love interest, and understanding what she symbolizes is easy when we consider what Forrest symbolizes. If Forrest symbolizes funding plus MK, what is the natural marriage to? The answer being blackmail plus children. This is why Jenny is portrayed as being sexually abused while Forrest is portrayed as being physically and emotionally abused. The connection between MK and blackmail world is intimate as they are both involving surveillance and storage of footage. Uranus/uranium, blackmail, and Pluto/plutonium, MK, those are consistent comms for distinguishing what kind of secret is involved. She has a father that was always kissing and touching her and her sisters. By praying to God, cross, she gets taken to a better home. This is a symbol of a way blackmail is used, as it's not just about controlling someone important but also the mentally disturbed, as it acts as a way to create pressure to force them to act against a specific target like JFK. This is how Lee Harvey Oswald was controlled, as I go into in several posts. Now we get to Forrest Gump's first run at fame. After being abused, he accidentally joins the sports team. The meaning for this is in how sports is tied to funding and ops. Games are used to send comms through the various events as key players on both sides coordinate. The popularity being also tied to the promotion as well as investment. Military is tied into these games as well. Forrest Gump as symbolic of funding fits as the best player of all time. This transitions into Forrest Gump helping with tearing down segregation. This may seem odd given the other comms, but it's not. I went over earlier in the post that World War II ended with a cooperation of military and Rothschild. There was a long stretch of time where the military coordinated with Rothschild for patriotic affairs, helping with funding things like this to course correct the damage done in the past by the same forces. So it's not all evil. At least a few points in history it was used to help guide things to a better future. This time the racist Wallace gets shot, the one behind it, so in both cases anyone that gets in the way of their decisions gets hurt. I go over those racial ops more in this post as they relate to sports coordination in my sports posts. Anyway, after attacking someone trying to rape Jenny, Forrest Gump gets to meet the president. Note he drank 15 Dr. Peppers. And then he talks about how both JFK and his brother died right after that. Dr. Peppers symbolizing, I suspect, the psychology ops being funded at the time. As you are surely aware if you've read my posts, that it was JFK where the CIA/Rothschild switched from allies to antagonists again with certain parts of the military. Forrest talks specifically of brothers, as in anyone connected to a target. Then Forrest volunteers to fight in Vietnam. This is a perfect transition as the MK ops that killed JFK were CIA. Moreover, as discussed before, Vietnam was Rothschild's infinite money check. Over $1 trillion when adjusted for inflation. Remember that the leader of Vietnam was tied to the symbol of the first ATM machine. This is why we transition here into Bubba Gum P, stock bubble symbol covered before, a man obsessed with talking about opening his own business for shrimp fishing. Why is he obsessed with cooking dozens of different types of shrimp? We'll get into this part later as it requires more film clues to unravel. Gump finds he is the perfect soldier as he does precisely what anyone asks him to do at all times. An ability to create a gun in record time. Earlier as he was assaulting Jenny's boyfriend he gave her some chocolates, and the next time we see her she's in Playboy. Same start as Marilyn Monroe. This led to her getting a showbiz start in theaters. Dream come true, though it's portrayed as sad, that she dissatisfied. Same thing with when Forrest assaults her boyfriends. I suspect their relationship is mirroring the constant back and forth rejection and acceptance of Forrest/Rothschild. This is the same story with Vietnam. People completely for the war early on, and it was only when Nixon ended it that his popularity plummeted. Note the names of the people in his platoon: Dallas, the place JFK was shot; Tex, as in Bush symbol, and Detroit, the symbol of dead automobiles. All of which Gump rescues from Vietnam. Controlled industries/factions. The war was designed to be endless as I went over earlier in the post, but it did end. And the ending is tied to Forrest getting shot in the but as Dan gets his legs blown off. Vietnam War was 1955-1975. Rothschild got their infinite money check through it, but who then was the faction fighting against it? This is where ping-pong diplomacy begins. Ice cream symbolism is a symbol for ice cream, which works as his legs were just taken. So what does it mean that Dan loses his legs and Gump switches to ping-pong? September 8, 1967. MKUltra Dr. Donald Duck Ewan Cameron dies of heart attack while mountain climbing. September 8, 1967. Forrest, Dan, and other soldiers are admitted to the Army hospital. The death of MKUltra, tied to when Dan loses his legs. This connection goes deep as Dan becomes the partner of Forrest Gump on his shrimping boat. I'm getting ahead of myself, but just keep in mind this connection between Dan as his superior officer and control of the MK Ops. It's integral to the whole film that people involved in that system are what get funding. So Gump switches from fighting in Vietnam to being recruited to speak against it. Playing both sides, and then meets up with the Black Panthers. You may recall them as the ones involved in the threats on Congress during Watergate. Right as Nixon ended Vietnam, those attacks flared up. A discussion of Jenny on LSD, and then we get a bug plus Rosemary's Baby and a famous star that died at age 26. I go over Rosemary's Baby in my Roman Polanski post. It is yet another MK movie, though it being made by child rapist Roman Polanski makes it more relevant than most of the others. This is where ping-pong diplomacy turns Forrest Gump into a celebrity. And it's tied to John Lennon, who along with Mao die soon after their encounter with Forrest Gump. He meets up with his old superior officer, and they get involved with prostitutes as the Old Astor Hotel is described on TV. This is where he commits himself to Forrest and asserts he'll be an astronaut the day it happens. Which, as this situation involves prostitutes and surrender, this is a reference to Chappaquiddick and the moon landing. Check my Kennedy post for more on how all that connects. July 16, 1969. Apollo 11 lifted off Cape Kennedy. July 19, 1969. Chappaquiddick incident destroys Ted Kennedy's career. July 20, 1969. Neil Armstrong moon landing and speech. The symbol there being how Ted Kennedy became the Kennedy to survive. And become best friends with HRC. Once again Forrest Gump meets the president, and right afterwards he destroys him. Unlike the other deaths, this one is explicitly Forrest Gump that triggers it. Because people hate Nixon, and so they can get away with making him the hero that takes him down. In fact, if you look up any YouTube video with Nixon talking about Watergate, you are likely to find a top comment referencing this scene. Forrest leaves military service and goes into business himself with ping pong. This is a reference to the competing. Remember Atari being Mossad and CIA rising up to take over the entire industry from them by funding Japan into the 80s bubble. So what does the shrimping boat symbolize? Note his hard luck until he does three things. One being cooperating with former military Dan, and the next is giving the boat the name Jenny. The final piece of the puzzle is asking for God's help. God helps by doing what? By summoning a hurricane to destroy all the shrimping competition. Natural disasters are used this way and many others. Suddenly they are rich as the only business in town. Lieutenant Dan made his peace with God, as in on good terms with Rothschild. This is juxtaposed with President Ford escaping assassination twice in 17 days. This next bit will be relevant later. September 22, 1975. Second assassination attempt forwarded by environmentalist Sarah Jane Moore. September 22, 1975. Squaresoft founded, Final Fantasy series. I said before to keep in mind Lieutenant Dan as the superior of Forrest and the MK connection, lost legs same day as the most famous MK doctor died, so what did their shrimping boat, Bubble Gum P, represent? Well, how does Forrest Gump become infinitely rich? It's by Lieutenant Dan getting him invested in Apple computers. Let me remind you that the origin of Apple computers is Atari. Where did Steve Jobs begin? Atari. What did he do just before Apple? LSD. I.e. MKUltra. Until he, just like Jenny, began LSD and then made Apple. Forbidden knowledge, symbol Apple of Eve. There is a direct connection between the video game industry and computer industry as we see here and other places. The removal of competition of the founders of it and the MK Ops and Roth funding, stock bubbles, being used to accomplish it. He makes up one more time with Jenny who had nowhere else to go, and she gives him shoes. This leads to the years-long run of Forrest Gump. Note crossing the Mississippi over and over again, symbol of long. Which fits with the 3-year run. This is where he funds various people, like a famous bumper sticker. And famous shirt, both of which by themselves would never become popular but through control of media they become famously popular. Forrest Gump finally stops running the day Ronald Reagan is shot. The implication being cooperating with the government again after a few years opposed and creating bubbles and murder. Jenny returns to him but with a child. This is the most important point of the movie. The debut of Haley Joel Osment as Forrest Gump Jr. If Forrest Gump symbolizes an iteration of Bretton Woods pumping, then what does his son of the same name represent? Forrest Gump Jr., the next iteration of the Bretton Woods. We can see this as the core of the film is Forrest constantly funding entities that turn against him. That's why him being smart is the core of the film. He watches Sesame Street. A comm I've tied to the MK Ops as comms aware people with kids could agree to open Sesame and open their homes to surveillance, and MK experiments on extra kids, and this fits with Lieutenant Dan, now part owner of Apple, with Forrest Gump with magic legs, just like his magic shoes. No longer directly connected but using shells across the world. This is why he marries an Asian woman. Teaching his son to play ping pong, reconcile with video game comms, and Haley Joel Osment playing the Kingdom Hearts main character. Disney plus Squaresoft combined. Note Haley Joel's career, which was top of Hollywood starting with Forrest Gump lasting all the way till 2003 and then a dead stop. Career crashed. This is the Iraq War transition in ops I frequently talk about. The reason why the Pope was changed in 2005 and much else, a big falling out with the pyramid and the White House. Check my Bush post. Haley equals following comet. April 1, 1997. Hale bought perihelion visible for 18 months across the world. April 1, 1997. Nintendo Pokémon begins airing, the biggest media franchise of all time, beating Star Wars. April 10, 1997. Tiger Woods wins first major tournament 2 months later. He set the record for the fastest ascent to number 1 in the official world golf ranking, relevant in this context later. Heaven's Gate cult committed mass suicide alongside this comet. This ties it to the MK Ops. They are fishing reconcile with Sixth Sense and child psychology in that film as a comm. A story that begins with a child psychologist being secretly killed by a patient of his. MK affiliates fake deaths to avoid reprisal. I'd need to watch the film to confirm that's the comm, but given everything else it seems likely. The final part of the film discusses whether things are predetermined or happen accidental-like. This perhaps being a commentary on the machinations behind the scenes of all those murders from people. A mixture of predetermined fate and the happenstance of people deciding to fight a battle they should know can't be won. The next thing to discuss is what is meant in the film by juxtaposing the old dumb Forrest Gump of Tom Banks with the new smart comet Haley Joel Osment. Why is the new system smarter than the old? Let's consider the transition. Know any famous figures with a name like Bretton Woods? Given Bretton means man from Britain, what kind of symbol do you think would be adapted if they removed that label? Tiger Woods spam. Did you know Tiger Woods is half Asian? 1/4 Chinese and 1/4 Thai. Did you know his initials are ET? Same as that film we went over, the most successful movie to that point. 1975. Tiger Woods born, first billionaire athlete. March 13, 1977. Forrest Gump Jr. is born in film. June 15, 1978. Tiger Electronics, first cross-control pad. October 6, 1978. Tiger Woods TV premiere 2 years old golf. October 16, 1978. Pope John Paul installed lasts till 2005. So once again we see the Pope transition with these kinds of comms, but it gets even more clear. Note Tiger has the name of his father. His father was born the same day of a famous killing of a Japanese leader. Who was most upset at Japan in 1932? That'd be China. E.T. Woods is 1/4 Chinese and half Asian altogether. Note his father died within a year of the Pope that began dying. October 6, 1978. Tiger Woods Bob Hope TV premiere 2 years old. October 16, 1978. Pope John Paul. April 2, 2005. Pope John Paul death. May 3, 2006. E.D. Woods death. The reasoning for the year difference is perhaps because faces are not just the one person but represent cells. Likely the cleanup of John Paul's associates took an extra year. Why the changes? I went over Pope John Paul transitioning against child predators not long before he was removed, the primary force that was moving against W. Bush due to his war on Iraq. Saudi Arabia with al-Walid having issues, and this is why the transitions of power in comms are critical to pay attention to. This is perhaps why. November 25, 2009. Tiger Woods' biggest scandal begins. National Enquirer publishes a story about his affair. November 27, 2009. Tiger Woods crashes Genesis Invitational into a fire hydrant and tree. November 25, 2009. Netanyahu declares 10-month settlement freeze on construction in West Bank. November 25, 2009. Saudi Arabia floods begin causing over $1 billion in damage including $270 million US losses. Now that we know Tiger Woods as a comm tied to funding these comms become clear. The scandal was an argument being had by Mossad and CIA. The 10-month freeze on West Bank construction is symbolic of Israel pausing their arrangement with CIA to suck up money. The scandal itself is because of how blackmail works, as Tiger Woods himself was symbolic of cooperation between various intel organizations, and so all sides could destroy him, but to do so would be breaking the arrangement between the sides. This fits other examples like the Nixon-Watergate situation above, exchange leverage for 49-50 state win, or Trump below. Probably the most clear example I've ever dug up. In each case leverage was exchanged for stardom, which was then cashed in when either CIA or Mossad felt it warranted. Check my intro section for more. October 6, 2016. Cable guy breaks John's funny bone. October 6, 2016. Tom Hanks coordinates girl stars to get ready to cook. October 7, 2016. Access Hollywood scandal begins. This of course means his infidelity was planned for. October 5, 2004. Tiger Woods' marriage goes on to seduce over 120 women focused on college girls. October 5, 2004. Leisure Suit Larry reboot, game about seducing many college girls. Tiger Woods was said to have 10 prostitutes at a time and at least 120 affairs. That kind of insanity isn't by accident. It's planned out and encouraged for him, as it meant the blackmail is more effective with each one making the commitment between CIA/Mossad through him that much stronger. Don't forget that Tiger Woods' first name is E, as in E.T. Woods. Symbolism tied to both comms, Morse code E and T are the building blocks, as well as a film that specifically was created to represent the power of the pyramid in driving society. Thus when Mossad used National Enquirer to destroy Tiger Woods, it was a hard stop to their existing arrangements, demanding a major change. Likely this was instigated by al-Walid using Obama to make some kind of change. As discussed in many posts, Obama is most tied to Saudi Arabia. Check my posts on Bush for more on that. Q highlighted 1/3 of the pyramid with Saudi Arabia, and when did that power installation happen? November 25, 1992. Princess Diana Prince Charles meeting decision to separate. November 25, 1992. Aladdin, Middle East worship Allah, film Princess Jasmine with Pet Tiger. November 25, 1992. I Will Always Love You, Bodyguard released by Houston highest grossing soundtrack. The end of one princess and the beginning of another. In fact, when I looked carefully I noticed, their breakup started specifically the same day Bill Clinton was elected. November 2, 06/1992 Princess Diana Prince Charles trip to South Korea causes breakup. November 3, 1992, election of Bill Clinton. I'm not sure the precise importance Saudi Arabia had before or after, but we can at least be sure there was a transition being marked at this date. The transition likely had to do with the biggest news story of the decade, the fall of the USSR between 1991–1992. I need to further investigate Princess Diana to fully understand her symbolism, but I did notice this. January 24, 1924. Russian city of St. Petersburg renamed Leningrad. January 24, 1924. Princess Diana's father born. 1991 Russian city Leningrad changed to St. Petersburg. 1992 Princess Diana's father death. 1992 Princess Diana breakup with Prince Charles. Given the breakup was in tune with Bush being outed of the White House, this would imply a connection between Princess Diana's marriage and Bush/Reagan in the White House. July 1980, Princess Diana begins dating Prince Charles after his breakup. July 1980, Reagan/Bush official nominee of Republican Party. January 20, 1981, Ronald Reagan/Bush inauguration date. February 24, 1981, Princess Diana engagement set. July 29, 1981, Princess Diana marriage to Prince Charles. That's too precise to be coincidence and indicates the relationship was symbolic for a collaboration. It suggests a Soviet and UK handshake, which given at the time Margaret Thatcher was in control that fits with the UK. The Soviet part is harder to define, but I do know that at least some of the Cold War spending was the same as with Vietnam, i.e. making banks happy by spending gazillions of dollars. Now this does not mean he's evil, quite the contrary, the comms are clear he was good. Just like with the Forrest Gump, divorce, uncoupling from the banks is designed to be impossible and getting installed in the first place typically involves cozying up to them. The assassination attempt in his first year is a big sign of forces not being happy with him, but it's hard to be certain which forces. Given time I'll fully map it out. You can see post by post I get closer and closer to it. There are only so many major players and countries and comms. So Tiger Woods, much like Forrest Gump, symbolized the funding and was tied into MK, entities that create killers get funding, which is why his symbolism marries Tiger and Bretton Woods, only instead of Bretton, man from Bretton, it's now symbolized by a mostly Chinese man. What does that remind you of? China goes from flat-lining economy to arguably surpassing the USA in economy size as Clinton is installed. So it all fits the comms with Tiger Woods, his rise symbolizing a change in approach by banks. This would be Clinton's 1994 NAFTA. Which just so happens to be the year Tiger Woods made his first big, non-junior, win. I'm reminded of Street Fighter and the spamming long-distance Tiger attacks of a crime boss of Thailand, the original boss of Street Fighter. Given Tiger Woods is 1/4 Thai, this fits. Read my mini Street Fighter post, as that game was launched specifically as promotion of MK Ops involving riots. February 6, 1991, Street Fighter Arcade released. March 3, 1991, Rodney King is beaten by 4 white police officers on videotape. April 5, 1992, LA riots triggered from acquittal of Rodney King officers. June 10, 1992, Street Fighter 2 released on home consoles. Also just noticed this today. July 2, 1955, Sagat original Street Fighter boss fictional birth. July 2, 1955, LBJ massive heart attack in Charlottesville, Virginia visiting daughter. Afraid of being alone after. Tiger is a symbol of a hidden predator waiting to attack. It applies to things that kill or threatens to kill. Kiddzz/Kiddzz coordination. Forrest Gump's child is related as a symbol to Tiger Woods. And since Haley Osment held that symbol, then that means his comms, while not identical, no Chinese symbolism tied to Osment, might be why his star faded in 2004 while Tiger stayed strong. They may give us some indication if we contrast. Osment's biggest film after his Forrest Gump debut? Obviously The Sixth Sense. August 6, 1999, Sixth Sense Child Psych MKUltra story Haley Joel, massive success. August 6, 1999, Iron Giant US premiere, Bomb, August 7, 1999, Thailand First Asian Youth Day. Iron Giant. A few interesting things about that, one being the massive difference as one was famously popular and the other died in the box office. A bomb. Even though both films are considered classics, only one made money, the other lost a ton of money. Given the connections between the two. A film that takes place the same day Sputnik launched. October 4, 1957, Sputnik PS-1 first satellite launched. October 4, 1957, Iron Giant movie begins. Boy and giant robot friend, boy plus recording device. October 4, 1957, Leave It to Beaver premiere. I've decoded Leave It to Beaver before. The symbolism is of blackmail using children. The idyllic setting symbolic of keeping a clean image. Actually the wide release matched up, but the pilot had its own comms. Here is from My Incredibles dig where they used capes to symbolize flags, control by a country through blackmail. Flag getting caught in a turbine. April 23, 1957, Leave It to Beaver pilot, It's a Small World. April 29, 1957, first military nuclear power plant dedicated in Virginia. The Iron Giant, just like Leave It to Beaver, involves a young boy, and in the film the Iron Giant sacrifices himself to protect a city from a nuke. This seems to symbolize someone with blackmail used to stop an emergency. Effectively having dirt so explosive they would be destroyed, they can then be employed to act rather than have it detonate. This is why the motive of the Iron Giant, recording device, is to hang around a little boy and stop a nuke from going off. That's my current interpretation. I will likely dig deeper into it later. The fact that Iron Giant failed and released the same day as Sixth Sense, and both stories involve a young boy paired with a supernatural being that comes back from death. Bruce Willis as a ghost, and the Iron Giant after being exploded. Why would one be more successful? The answer is one had Bretton Woods symbolism and the other did not. This may well have been another example on the necessity of having the banks behind it. Iron Giant is said to have failed due to poor marketing, and I suspect it was always intended to be the best possible movie specifically to demonstrate the difference of pushing pop culture. Sixth Sense became deeply integrated into culture with "I see dead people," a catchphrase repeated for years. This is why they were pitted against one another, a show of strength. Iron Giant has a higher rating average from viewers, 96% vs 86%. Yet it fared dramatically worse and had no impact on pop culture. It gave them a reason to make Sixth Sense a meme. It reminds me of Firefly in the way that these pieces of media become part of pop culture for a goal even when they fail. Firefly was designed to be as good as possible so as to contrast with its death. It was designed to be resurrected from death. Iron Giant was designed to be good as well, but with the intent of being ignored. The comms sent are practically irrelevant compared to that, but they still tell a story. Sixth Sense stars Bruce Willis as a child psychiatrist that has a patient that becomes a maniac. Exactly how MK works, his name Malcolm Crow, a symbol tied to those murder ops I went over last post, and others. The symbol of him being dead could be in how the psychologists behind MK ops disappear after activation. Avoid reprisal. Also another show Steven Spielberg was involved in. Though not this episode. December 23, 1972, The Sixth Sense final episode, The Eyes That Wouldn't Die. December 23, 1972, The Immaculate Reception Oakland Raiders at Pittsburgh Steelers. Remember all those theft comms I went over before by Spielberg? There's a rabbit hole here I could go further in, but not today. Instead, let's talk about how Steven Spielberg partnered with Warner Brothers not long before they released Iron Giant. Animaniacs being the end result of it, and it was a massive success. A goal is necessary for success, and in the case of that show it was designed, and in this case it would be coordinating children. Note the plots of the first episodes. One involving hiring children to paint naked people for the Pope. Another involving a shepherd dog named Buttons who, as the theme song states, is always chasing Mindy, a little girl with a lowly designed with a hypnotic swirl. Buttons equals keyboard. This was 1993 when the early internet was launched. This is about getting MK Ops to push targets into looking at children online to turn them into predators. When you understand this, the entire story goes from nonsensical to clear. This is the reason the dog gets punished for trying to catch Mindy, a plot that repeats in every iteration of their story. This is why it often shows Mindy riding as in driving Buttons like a car. As the lyrics of the song involves, we have pay-for-play contracts, this was symbolism intended for young clowns to guide them to work together with the promise of work. The MK world is the way clowns can get an early start as they help brainwash children their own age. Auntie plus maniacs. And so the kids would watch the episodes and then use the episodes as guiding lights. Wearing something like a hat with Wacko Warner giving a catchphrase of something like, "Look, it's a butt." Which when combined with other comms would be like a billboard of what they were doing. The target is conditioned in all sorts of ways. Trauma on a young child creates a suggestible state. The kids coordinate to lure targets into those traumas. Like with Buttons and Mindy, rather than risk them having self-improvement, only pastimes that exacerbate their situation are allowed. Like video games. This is perhaps why Poltergeist portrays their future use as creating brain-dead children. Mindlessly grinding a role-playing game, for example, the act of driving, is why Final Fantasy uses an artist famous for Speed Racer. Fast driving. The goals are numerous, but due to my background it's easier for me to discuss the MK Ultra abuses. One example of comms being used for coordination was in getting the subject to imitate a car engine noise. They would positively reinforce them whenever he would make a sound like NRR. A symbol of driving, and thus they would train them to do little quirks like that as it was akin to making a show. To that end, take this game for example. Called Elnerd in Japan but changed dramatically in a curious way for the US launch. A game mostly remembered for grinding. Being forced to just hit the button for 70 hours straight, but I bring this one up because of the translation differences. The US version made the characters weaker and enemies stronger so as to create a 70-hour game from a 30-hour one. What is most interesting about that is they also changed the colors to make them more intense with a bright bull charging red rather than the mild earth colors. I suspect these kinds of things were tests in conditioning. The surveillance watching targets and contrasting the regions with a change like this to see the relative effect on the brainwashing. Both that game and Final Fantasy and many other early RPGs involve raising orphans to a quest for, protecting crystals. There are interviews where this is explicitly stated by the creator of the common thread tying all the early Final Fantasy games. Orphans and protecting crystals. It wasn't until this week that solved the meaning of that, and it's tied into everything I've covered in this post. December 18, 1987. Final Fantasy I, Nintendo. December 21, 1987. Tingen founded, Atari. December 20, 1987. Phantasy Star, Sega. Read the history section above if it's not clear. This was a message that Atari was dead. Their Final Fantasy, a reference to their biggest franchise. Nintendo went out of their way to sabotage Tengen, and you can read all the ways they fought above. This was once the Atari was dead, and so the remnants of Atari tried to continue working through Nintendo, and instead the response was Final Fantasy, as in no. And so they died. Every repetition of Final Fantasy therefore is not the Final Fantasy for them, but for someone else who wants to butt in on the industry without going through the proper channels and becoming an ally. With this context and the games in mind, the symbols of orphans as MK Ops become more pronounced, and the point is in protecting that system so that young clowns can have their communities of driving/blackmail, as that is the foundation for the next generation of CIA. At least it is for the ones not already multimillionaires. Even when they do become super rich, the primary output is often games like these which simply exist to promote that system. For regular people it may not seem plausible that they could sacrifice a child and become attached, but you have to understand the mechanics. Animaniacs and the other Steven Spielberg cartoon especially was right around the time of the internet coming into popular usage. The superpower show of this one involves a kid hitting delete and then getting all the powers of the internet. The people helping on the ground level would get a path to wealth through these depending on their aptitudes. Effectively, people still have to be able to perform the job, but as the structure of the company at key hiring positions is run by insiders, anyone tied to that system gets preferential treatment. Particularly in getting the job in the first place, but also using comms gives a superpower of a sort in understanding what is desired. It's about following secret orders and pushing things in a very specific direction. There are many comms that paint out the jobs available. Myst. The two biggest PC games tell the story. Both 1993, just like Animaniacs with buttons. I've gone over Doom in many posts as a threat. December 7, 1993, New York Long Island rail shooting. December 7, 1993, Donald Trump asserts he will reevaluate life due to the Long Island rail shooting. December 10, 1993, Doom released. December 14, 1993, Aurora, Colorado for dead mass shooting. But not Myst. Note the release date in relation to the www. Myst focuses on linking books, which in 1993 would be quite novel, as the entire plot of Myst tells the player to create a linking book to which they get their page added to. As in getting a website up on the new internet. Note the rocket ship puzzle to ride, you have to use a keyboard. Which reminds me of this. June 23, 2005, Reddit founded. June 25, 2005, top YouTube video, I Want It That Way, top video 11 days 184K views, To Chinese Boys / Red Rocket. Top video of all time, breaking YouTube records in 2005 with 184K views. Chump change now, but record breaking at the time. And the message sent of promoting something. Having it be a lip-syncing parody of the Backstreet Boys means I would need to decode them to fully understand, but given how rocket comms were used by Myst, there's a clear path to understanding. Myst navigates like a web page as you click through the world, and its existence was likely tied to that push for the web. In my last post I went over Myst comms as they tied to Stephen King, and when we consider that title, Myst, it's Myst plus my. As in your personal world, but the ticket to success in that world is what is given. Often the MK Ops are how kids support their parents or otherwise use as an umbrella. There's plenty more worth going into, but the post is pretty much full, so let's finish up with a short update. Updates. Since I went into Bretton Woods history in this post as it began with the Atlantic Charter, it's worth noting this recently happened. June 10, 2021, New Atlantic Charter, Joe Biden and Boris Johnson redefine Western alliance effort to stake out a grand vision for global relationships. The primary purpose of which is defining territorial adjustments. Each country controlling itself, which is in stark contrast to the banks. Though I may be reading too much into that. Check my COVID post for more on how and when Biden flipped, as well as the plan there, but none of that could have been possible without bank control. Q confirmed the Fed takeover. I decoded some of the comms leading up to it. There are many more than this covered in other posts. Note Trump getting a cake covered in gold, as well as the vault opening as in funding. May 14, 2018, Federal Reserve vault opened by Trump. Kiddzz involves arms around Kiddzz, protection symbol. June 11, 2018, Trump gets gold cake in Singapore. June 25, 2018, Wedding Cake Championship, over-the-top cakes. June 26, 2018, Trump vault open to Federal Reserve U.S. mail. This solves cake symbolism as it implies commitment. As in creating a plan and following through. The cake symbolizes the op pitched and delivered. The fact that the gold cake was given in Singapore is likely implying the pitch to people who want money. This was likely asking for ops to begin the protection ops for families, as that is the biggest issue we keep seeing year after year. Threats breaking apart every attempt at recruiting. Since then, we've had COVID and a transition of presidents. I've covered both of those as ops tied to the end of the MK world. One of these psyops being George Floyd, and this week I noticed a new internet historian video which clued me in on the third biggest news story between World War I and World War II. A man named Floyd trapped in a cave who died on Friday the 13th. The main thing is I'm confident of in digging into this is it was a carefully crafted narrative meant to push a new format of radio. I would have a hard time coming up with a more tantalizing narrative to keep people tuned in day after day. A story designed to grip people. Note the fact that churches promoted it, Congress promoted it, all the newspapers promoted it, and most importantly it was one of the first big radio promotions. The story is insane and clearly a lie, but when we understand the motives it makes sense. Note that it was the third biggest story in between WW1 and WW2, the first two biggest stories were both Charles Lindbergh. If you've read recent posts you know he was tied to all sorts of blackmail comms during that time period. Oh, and as for the reason why this comm is being covered. Note the name of the guy involved, Floyd Collins. Just like George Floyd. May 24, 2020. Taylor Swift, Killing Eve, hit song, Look What You Made Me Do, Eve equals tomorrow. May 25, 2020. George Floyd murder leads to organized rioting. May 29, 2020. Biden congratulates Swift action. May 29, 2020. Taylor Swift blasts Trump for Floyd riots. This may give us the clue as to that being a psyop, something I already covered, but I had no idea the name was already attached to a famous one. I know above that makes it look like Biden is the bad guy. I thought so too at the time, but since then I've come to realize that the op to remove Trump was cooperative with him, and the purpose of an event like this was to map out criminal rioters funded by Soros. Just read my COVID posts if that's confusing. The world is not what it looks like at times. Anyway. Whether this internet historian coverage means some kind of change in those ops I can't say, but it felt like it was worth discussing. I love his videos, so an excuse to talk about them is nice. One big change recently is NFTs went from absurdly high to almost dead. I decoded these as related to rescuing victims by funding, and note, bubble, as I suspect the funding tied into that. Those same funding mechanisms retooled for a better purpose. NFTs are so absurdly ridiculous when you get down to what is being bought, it's just bluntly a scam, but that's the point. Usually they have some modicum of illusion of value so that it would give them an excuse in court if a connection was ever made to the illegal activity. But here, the opposite is true. It's bluntly stupid to make it clear in the future they were funding these specific ops. Getting behind rescue ops. It may be worthless now, but in the future it's a badge of honor. Again, read my other posts for more on the specifics of this and all the other references I made. Search function is on this page. It winding down likely means another transition in ops. As for what comes next, hard to be sure, but if I keep solving these comms I'm sure it'll become clear. I heard there is a big promotion going on about the newest Halloween film being the final one. Given my decodes of that franchise, which ties to not just Star Trek but Lord of the Rings and so much else, that sounds promising. Especially the fact that the last film was always planned to tie into this one. This means it was a larger plan that's ongoing and from 2018 was always designed to end this year. That fits quite well with 2018 ops moving into final stages this year. Though that may be wishful thinking on my part, I have no idea when things will end, but they can't go on forever. One thing is for sure. I'll keep digging into history for as long as I'm allowed to, and given how far I've come that has got to be encouraging for any following this trek. Telegram chat. Join our Telegram group chat. Send leads, begin decoding. This has been Tom Banks, Bretton Woods to Forrest Gump to Tiger Woods.